Welcome back. Today I want to show you how I go about installing rods and pistons. So in the last video we went through how to balance the rods and pistons, and the first step of installing them is obviously to orientate the rod to the piston correctly. See those little grooves there? Those grooves need to go on the exhaust side. I hear some people talk about the eagle logo pointing towards the front of the engine. That's not always the case. In my particular setup, that would mean that the bearing grooves would be on the inlet side, which is incorrect. So anyway, I've orientated this properly. I use a little bit of assembly lube, not too much, because you really don't want that assembly lube in the bore area, because it might jeopardize the way it wears in, because you really want to have run-in oil. So just a very light coat. Eagle and Wiseco have what they call floating pins, so this is not a press fit, it's just a nice transition fit through the piston, through the rod, and quite easy to install. Once you get that in, it's quite easy. You just want to make sure that it all feels nice, it moves freely, and then you've got to put the circlip in. The circlip is a bit of a pain to get in, but there is a bit of a knack to it. Once you do it a few times, it's not too bad. You notice I don't put the rings on, because what I'm going to do in a minute is install these pistons to check the bearing clearances, and I want to do that without the rings so I can take them out again and make sure everything's okay. So just repeat the process. Install the bearings the same way as we did with the mains on the block. Clean them off with alcohol, push them in, and these are now ready to go. Again, in the last video I weighed all of these, so these have all been pretty much perfectly balanced. Repeat the process over and over. It is a bit tedious, but like I said before, you only do this once. You really want to get it right before you find yourself with problems and then not knowing what your measurements were. So pretty much nearly got these all ready. The rings were set up already. Again, there's another video about that, so have a look at that on how to set the gaps. What I'm doing now is I'm just putting the piston in dry, so again you don't need any lube. I'm using plastic gauge to check the clearance, so same way I did the mains. Put the plastic gauge in there. Notice I've got my finger under that rod. Without the rings on, it is very important to hold it up, otherwise it will simply drop out onto the ground, which wouldn't be a good thing. One by one, tighten these up. Again, if you're using eagle rods, make sure you understand what bolts you've got. There's all different size bolts and types that have different torques. So for this, it's about 43 pounds torque. I've gone 45, close enough. Tension it up. While it's in here, it's a good idea to measure the thrust. So 3T-GTE, the factory thrust clearance should be between 6 thou and a max of 12. You can't really see it here, but that's 9 thou, which is towards the upper end, but that's fine. Undo these bolts. With Eagle, there's a little dowel that holds that cap between the cap itself and the rod. It's a little bit tricky to get out, so you'll see in a moment. What I do is just use a pair of pliers, wiggle it off, and then once it's off, then I can see that plastic gauge and measure the clearance. So I'll repeat this process a few times. Here's the plastic gauge. It's a little bit hard to see in this video, but I'll change the angle a little bit. You can actually see it's right on 1 thou. I'll check another journal. And good news for me was that they're all very consistent at 1 thou clearance. So at this point, happy with the clearances. I've got all of the pistons bolted up, ready to go. All the clearances are right, and we're pretty much ready to put this together for the final time. Again, I like to write the specs down, so what I've recorded is the thrust clearance, the bearing clearance, and the piston to bore clearance. Thrust was all between 9 and 10 thou, which is okay. Bearing clearance was 1 thou across the board. The Toyota spec, the minimum is 9/10 of 1 thou, so it's on the tighter end, which is fine. And the bore clearance, the machine shop did this very excellent job, really, between 2.7 and 3.0 thousandths of an inch. So Wiseco say 2.5 thou, I've gone slightly bigger to allow some extra boost in the clearance. So there's my rings already. What I'm doing now is just marking the position of the ring. So this one here is the top of the oil ring, the bottom of the oil ring, and the gap where the oiler joins up. So the oiler, hopefully you can see in this video, it needs to butt up so the faces are like this, and they don't like that, and they don't overlap. Otherwise you're going to get problems. So this one goes on. Pretty straightforward, easy to get that on. Then what I do is I then put the bottom ring on, which goes underneath that oiler. They're quite thin rings. You do need a ring expander to do this properly. And but having said that, the oil rings are too thin to use, so you can just put them on by hand. Line the gaps up, bottom ring and then the top ring for the oiler. They go on quite easy. And once they're on, then it's time to look at installing the second compression ring next. So you work your way up, and then the top compression ring. You do need a ring expander before you put them on. You can hopefully see here on the left hand side there's a little N stamped on that ring. That N needs to point upwards, so that's the second compression ring. The profile is actually different between each side of that ring. Same applies to the top compression ring, which is what we have here. See that little N? Make sure that's facing up. So to put these in, we need to mark the gap firstly. So the top compression ring has the gap towards the back of the engine, and the second compression ring has the gap towards the front, so they are opposing each other. Make sure the end's facing up. Here's my ring expander. There's a few different types around. I went for this one because it supports the side walls of the ring. Be careful with these, they're not very hard to break if you overdo it, so you just want to position it, open the ring up just enough. Really, I don't recommend installing these by hand, because what will happen is you'll twist that ring, and it's not a good way to put them on. So ring expander, they're not expensive. Open it up like this. Don't go crazy, just lower it down. Once it's in the groove, let go, and that ring will sit there quite nicely. And once it's in, it's easy to move around into the right position. So that's the second compression ring in, and then what I do is do the same with the top compression ring. End facing up, have it held properly. See the gap on number 1 there, and even if you don't get that in the right spot, you can always rotate it very easily once it's on, but I try to get it in the right spot. Put that in, and that one there is ready to go. So once you've got this far, repeat the process 4 times over. Rather than bore you with this, here's the finished product with all 4 pistons ready to go. You can see they're marked number 1 to 4, so I know which bores, because the bore to piston clearance is obviously bore specific, because there's very minor differences in diameter with those pistons. Final check to make sure the gaps are in the right spot, and then what you need, take the bottom cap from the rod, and then you'll need a ring compressor. So what that does is squashes down those rings to the same diameter as the piston, so they can actually go into the block without any damage. And before that, you should oil them. So I like Penrite, that's proper running in oil. Don't use synthetic oil, that will cause all sorts of problems for you. It'll glaze the bores and you won't run in properly. So this is run in oil. My engine's going to be out of action for a while because I've got quite a bit to do and I want to modify the electronics on this engine. So I'm putting a good amount of oil on, probably more than what you need. I don't think there's any harm in this. Make sure it goes in the ringlands, and I then also apply a good dose of oil around the bores. Got that all on there. There's the ring compressor. Ring compressor just slides over quite easily. One final check, I've got the gaps right. Once that ring compressor's on, you basically just lower it carefully into the bore, and I generally just give that piston a tap down with the soft end of a hammer, or you could use something similar. Some people say you can push them in. I find they're a little bit tight to do that. So there's a bit of oil on that bore, running in oil of course, not assembly lube, not synthetic oil. Tap that in, goes in quite nice. As soon as it clears that ring compressor, it'll just release like that. At this point, those rings are pretty tight. You can rotate this engine, you don't have to worry about it falling out, it's not going to fall out. So I just turn the engine block up the other way, provide myself a bit of clearance, get in there with assembly lube. So now that I know the gap's all ready to go, assembly lube on the rod journal and also on the bearing, being careful that you obviously don't want to get lube underneath that bearing face. The cap goes on only one way, so make sure you've got those marks lined up. Eagle also provides ARP grease, so you need to have ARP grease on this to get the right torques. Tension them down. Again, we know that everything's right, so in this case I'm just going to use my torque wrench and tension these up to about 45 pounds, which is what they need to be, and then again slowly work through and do the same thing on all 4 pistons. That one's all done. Just give it a quick turn, make sure everything's alright. Looking good. Next piston goes in. I've already oiled that bore. Gentle tap in, don't want to hit it hard. If something goes wrong, stop tapping it, find out what's going on. But as you can see, that goes in pretty easy. Get that cap on, same process all over again. Don't mix the caps up, don't mix the pistons up, make sure they go in the right bores, take your time, and it's really not that complicated. Tensioning these up, it's all going quite smoothly. One thing I've underestimated is actually how much work is involved in this bottom end. There's a lot more to it, and it's taken a lot more time than I expected, but there again, I have really spent a lot of energy trying to get this exactly right, because I don't want to pull this apart again. So there's a third one going in. You'll notice that there's a very nice finish on that block, so I'm going to use a MLS head gasket. When you do that, you really want to have a surface finish better than 20 to 30, they say, RA, and RA is just known as a roughness average. That's actually been surfaced down to a RA of 13, so I shouldn't have any problems with the head gasket. But again, you know, all this stuff's worth it in the end, I think, when you put it back together and there's no problems. Once I finish this, I've actually got a windage tray I want to put on the bottom of this sump from Moroso, and a high performance sump. So it's starting to look quite nice. 4th piston going in. Good amount of oil in there, same thing on the piston. Get it set up, orientate it properly, tap it in, and push it down a little bit. Assembly lube, that Royal Purple, I think is great stuff. The only thing I don't like about that is it's a little bit sticky and you tend to lose the feel. So what I mean by that is when you rotate it with assembly lube, it's a bit tighter, and it can be a bit misleading on what the clearances are like. So for me, knowing what the clearances are give me a lot of peace of mind, because it certainly feels different to just having oil in there. But when you start these engines up after a big overhaul, you want to have assembly lube just to make sure you don't have any metal to metal contact. Once I got them all done, I gave a bit of a wipe down, The bores are very tidy in this. They look excellent. Feels good. One of the last things I did was just put the front pulley on the crank just so I could turn it around a couple times, just make sure I couldn't feel any tight spots, and it looks all great. The next stage is just finishing off this bottom end, so I'll put the sump on, put the timing gear on, the front cover on, and then finally I will be able to get into building the head and then putting this engine finally back in the car.